Justine Sass. She is the Chief of the Section of Education for Inclusion and Gender Equality at UNESCO. She has been a champion for gender equality, girls and women's empowerment for the past 25 years. Welcome, Justine. And I wanted to kick it off with a quote from one of the blogs and videos that I was talking about that really moved me. It's a story of Angel from Tanzania. And this quote is powerful. It says, "If a woman is uneducated, unemployed, doubtful, and unable to stand on her own 2 feet, life can be cruel to her." And that really is true and touched me. So welcome, Justine. And we'll kick it off by saying last year was crazy. So what was COVID like for you?
Last year was crazy. This year so far is also crazy. So it's still not a was, it's still an is, I would say. But we're managing. I noticed this morning, this week rather, on Tuesday, I guess it was, my phone woke me up with a note saying it was Groundhog Day. And I thought, oh, really? It's Groundhog Day every day. Every day is a bit the same. And I'm sure everyone is really feeling like that. But I'm based in France. And so here the situation has been quite a little bit different. I mean, it's been evolving over the last year. And we had schools closed last term, but they've been open since September. We have a curfew here. We have to be indoors by 6. But we're managing. We're managing.
Yeah, and I think we've all become used to so many new things. We're resilient in that sense, but maybe also a little bit too thick-skinned, maybe. So there was a question from Dr. Shivani Nair. She's from the UNDP, and she was a interviewee last week on the Field Note series. So she asks you, how is UNESCO addressing the impact of COVID on girls? We know no school, more violence, child marriages, early pregnancies. What is UNESCO doing about it?
Great question. So in March of last year, at the very beginning of the pandemic, UNESCO started what's called the Global Education Coalition. We now have more than 160 members. And the focus is really around ensuring continuity of learning, return to school, and basically helping education systems build their own resilience and address the concerns that teachers are facing, that children are facing, that parents are facing, as best as they can. And so Technovation is part of the Global Education Coalition. It's really changed, I think, the way that we've been working at UNESCO, because we're really trying to catalyze cooperation. We can only do things better together than we can do alone. And so what we've been doing, we've got 3 different flagships within it. And so we have one flagship that's called the Gender Flagship, which is very much looking at the gender dimensions of school closures. So trying to understand the data, as was mentioned by UNDP, we do know that schools closed, the fact that schools are closed isn't just impacting on education, it's also impacting on the experience of violence during quarantine and lockdown. It's impacting on access to food security because many children get their only meal of the day at schools. It's impacting on early pregnancy and child marriage. UNFPA projects that we may have up to 13 million more girls married early by 2030. And so we're really trying to the best that we can, get as much information as we can in the first instance to try to really understand what's happening, what are the factors that are driving some of these exclusion and marginalization and experience of violence, trying to advocate for continuity of learning and return to school, and then really trying to broker cooperation so that we can support countries to continue to address what we see as girls' pressing concerns in the context of COVID-19.
Yeah, and I think education, we're part of the education sort of community. And one question I have for you is, what should we be doing based on what you've been finding? And I like the idea of first collect the data. We've been doing this on our, like I said, we've been comparing the impact of COVID on our girls, not just in 2020, but comparing it to the past 5 years, because trying to understand where are the gaps, what can we do better. So what is your advice for practitioners on the ground? What can we be doing to be ahead of this?
So I think we have to realize that at the peak of the pandemic, we had 1.6 billion learners out of school. 90% of the world's population was was no longer in schools. And while many countries have moved towards remote learning, there's still about a third of students that had no access to remote learning during this time. And that's obviously, the most vulnerable, the hardest to reach, and in many cases, girls, because of more preferential access by voice to technology when it's available. So one of the things I think we have to focus on is the potential for learning loss. Already, we had half of students that were not reading or writing, and so by some predictions, this might be 72 million primary school age children that cannot read by the age of 10, what we call learning poverty. And that's, that has not just an effect on those children, it will stretch over decades. So we're looking at, what some are calling a generational catastrophe. And so we have to find new ways to reach those learners, to engage those learners, to look at when schools reopen, how are we going to offer accelerated programs for them, and how are we going to support them? So that would be my first point, is look at, think about learning loss and how can we A, avoid it, and then B, address what, when schools reopen, think about how we can engage with children and to help close those gaps. The second one is that we know that COVID is most likely to exacerbate these inequalities that existed before COVID. And what I mean by that is that we already had 260 million children, adolescents, and youth that were out of school before COVID took place. We at UNESCO predict that there may be around 24 million children that don't go back to school. We don't know what the numbers will be yet, but there's a great concern that that we're simply going to lose, particularly girls to adolescent marriage, to child marriage, and then pregnancy. These issues I've already spoken to. So I think we really have to be prioritizing, again, reaching the most vulnerable, and really this sort of principle of leaving no one behind. The third one is something we're really trying to get our heads around, which is financing for education. This is less, I guess, an issue for practitioners on the ground, but it's more of a concern that we have, which is that we've already seen that many low and middle income countries have already cut their education budgets, and that donor countries are also not available to engage in education in the same way as they did in the past. And so we're really concerned about what that's going to mean for financing education, financing quality education, and what it's going to mean for out-of-pocket expenditures for people in countries. And so I think we need to continue our advocacy and really push for sustained financing in education and making sure the budgets don't shrink. And then the last thing I would say is that it's not just an education issue. So we really need to be also looking at the health issues, the protection issues, the nutrition issues that I referred to earlier, and working across sectors. So it's not just education that needs to reply to this unprecedented disruption to education, but we need to work with across all sectors, and we're in it for the long haul. I mean, this isn't just an immediate impact. We have to be thinking about what can we do now, what can we do when schools open up again, and what do we need to do to really strengthen systems so that they push for equality, they push for inclusion, and that they're really gender transformative and are bringing girls back into the system and addressing all these gender related barriers to education.
Yeah, I think the picture is dire, but then I also have my engineer brain, like every problem you were saying, well, it can be solved, and I think we have to sort of keep that as a goal. And I also think like the girls who are going into child marriages and early pregnancies, we shouldn't give up on them. I think that is like connecting with them through technology. And I know so many Technovation girls. I remember many years ago, there was an app, a group of like 12, 13-year-old girls created a safe community forum for victims of child marriage. And that was so many years ago. And it broke my heart, but it was like, okay, this is how they're using technology to tackle this.
That's fantastic. If I can just give an example of something that we see as kind of a success story, not so much a success story now, but during Ebola, I mean, we've also been looking a lot at what can we learn from previous health crises and how can we apply that learning to the current one. And in Ebola, in some of the most affected communities, up to adolescent pregnancies rose by up to 65% in some of those communities. And at the time, Sierra Leone had a policy banning pregnant girls and young mothers from coming back to school. And so these children basically, these girls basically no longer had access to education. It was the end of their education. And because of a lot of advocacy and work around that, they overturned that policy. And so I think it's really important that we're also looking at making sure that these girls still have access and can return to school. They can continue learning through, modalities like you've just suggested, but then that they have a right to education just like everyone else does.
So to move to sort of the story of hope and action, maybe you can tell us what's your favorite story as you work through 2020 and COVID.
Can I tell you two?
Yes, of course.
Well, the reason why I say can I tell you two is one, because one of them involves Technovation, and so you'll have heard me already and my joy about this story, but we cooperated with Technovation last year on a pilot online training program, and at the end of it was in 6 countries in multiple geographic zones, so Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And at the end of it, you organized this event to celebrate the successes of these girls from 10 to 18. And because Zoom is as it is, it was a mosaic of these just faces from all over the place, and the grins and just how excited they were and how much learning they had. And for me, that pushed me through half of 2020, just the energy and the kind of excitement about the learning that took place on that. So that would be one. And then on my second one is just during COVID-19 and what are they doing? How are they learning? And actually it wasn't even an objective around what are they doing. It was more, how are they managing during COVID-19? And some of the things that came out of it were just astounding. So we had a girl from Nepal, a girl from Kenya, a girl from Somalia, and a girl from Afghanistan. And the girl from Somalia was in a refugee camp, Halima. And it was just extraordinary because not just for her, but in many of these, the girls are learning there, but they're also encouraging learning in their communities. They're doing outreach. They're doing outreach not only, to make sure that their friends are learning, but they're doing broader outreach to make sure that all girls are learning, all children are learning, sharing resources, sharing materials. And in the case of Halima, which I understand we'll share the link with in the chat function, she's also doing outreach around child marriage. And so to really, ensure that girls in that context, very difficult contexts, refugee camps in Somalia, are able to continue their education. And for me, these stories are nourishing and help us keep getting up in the morning.
Yeah, for me too. And I think this year we're having these Technovation live sessions inspired by that. I think every week we have roughly 200 girls from all over just working through the curriculum, and they're like, okay, this is why we do the work, and there's energy, and these girls are so, like you said, right? Like they nourish our energies. So I put the link to the playlist into the chat function. So I think gaming to me is a very, very interesting mode of learning that maybe parents don't think children are learning, and there's some sort of element of policing over there. But I think there's something to explore over there. And especially during COVID, like I don't know any kid who's not playing games in some level. So I think that the kinds of problems we are facing now, when you said it's not just education, it's health, it's nutrition, there's so many elements. I think the virtual world can allow for lots of simulations, right? And lots of strategy games, and so it's a complex system. And I'm thinking that, and the UNDP report also talks quite a lot about the importance of complex systems thinking, where you're not just shooting for one output, right? So what are your thoughts on how we can begin to introduce sort of these complex problems to students?
So first I would say, I think it's probably a better time than ever to be looking at how to do this, because I think, many education ministries are now thinking about what do they need to prioritize in education. There's this whole kind of reimagining education, rethinking, what do we need to cover? Is our education preparing children for the world that we live in today? I think with COVID-19, with climate change, with globalization, with all of these things, what we call wicked problems, that we really need to be able to kind of break them down, to think about what they mean, to understand how they interlink, and how we can be creative in finding ways to address these intersecting challenges. it's a so and gaming is one, and systems thinking I think is one important way to do that. For me, how can we do it? I think you're probably much better placed than I am, but just some initial reflections on this. I think for me, the working around systems thinking, thinking about how to integrate systems thinking isn't necessarily asking countries to add a new element into their curriculum, but that we're actually looking at what are the approaches that we could be using inside and outside of classrooms, and how do we teach them, and what are the skills that we really want to see out of it. And so I think a lot of the work that Technovation has been doing around sort of looking at problem solving and looking at how do we make in a science classroom, for example, how do we enable our students to think about what are the problems that they're facing in their own communities, whether it be garbage removal, whether it be traffic jams, whether any of these things, right? So how can we make them relevant? I think in that way it can also help learners contextualize it and make it less abstract and apply it to their own setting. I also think observation is a good way to do it as well. I mean, so in so many contexts, it's still chalk and talk, or it's still whatever's in the image in the classroom. And I think gaming and other ways of kind of using observation in an interesting online potentially way, enables us to kind of break out of the mold and help us think in a different way. I must say I struggle regularly with my children around gaming, but I do recognize that it does have a value, and that it can be very much applied as a way of learning. Children like doing it, and we need to find ways to bring gaming practically into the classroom, looking at ways that we can measure learning in that context too. And I think the other thing which is great about gaming is that it's collaborative often. So many of the platforms are collaborative, so you can also look at learning in a way where peers are working together, or they're working with somebody else and they're building off of each other to really enhance the learning. And the last thing I would say on this, we also, in the context of STEM, are looking at how, and this is not moving, I guess, back away from gaming as an approach, but the way that we are pushing for kind of improvements in STEM education is that you don't look at it as an S, a T, an E, and an M, but how do they all come together, and how can we teach them in ways that help break down these disciplines and help people really think cross-disciplinarily, and how they and how all of these things are combined. They come together.
Yeah, I think, the problems that you outlined, the long-term effects of COVID, right? Like, who will be solving some of these, right? It'll be the young people, right? And so it's not going to be one thing that we have to get one number up. We have to get everybody has to thrive. So that's an example of a complex problem, and it's a real problem, right? That you're not going to tackle with S and T, E, and M, right? So, okay, just we'll quickly wrap up. I'm curious, what is the biggest surprise you've had in the last few months?
I think the biggest surprise we all had was how fast it took to get a vaccine for COVID-19. So, for me, that was the biggest surprise of 2020, and one that we were obviously super concerned about. So pleasantly surprised about that. Still have concerns about other aspects, but I think this is, something that we can all be happy about, a good surprise.
I agree. I'm watching on the New York Times the number of people who have been vaccinated. That's increasing slowly on a daily basis. What's an area that you're curious about?
An area that I'm curious about. I think what I would like to know what the numbers really are, because I think at the moment, a lot of the things that, talking about COVID in particular is something I'm curious about. I think, we've got all these sort of projections, and so, we think that there will be 13 million more child marriages. We think, and obviously we don't know, and we think that 24 million children might not come back to school, but I'm keen that we do more research, and we are on the ground more, and we're asking people more about what's happening. And so we've launched a global study on the gender dimensions of COVID-19, which is really going to be digging deep in a certain number of countries. And I'm keen that we hear from people about what it is that they're really experiencing, and what's working in those contexts, what isn't, and what do we really need to be concerned about and taking action on. Data collection and long-term study of it, right? I think it's not completely action-oriented, but I think it's so critical, and that's what we're going to be trying to do as well. So that's good advice. What is one book we should read so that we are better human beings? think we're a better human being anytime we read a book. So I mean, the general statement would be read a book. But I have pulled a book out. It's actually not a new book, but it's a book that I read. I think when it came out in 2016 or 17, and which I read again during COVID-19. And I think it's a great book because I think many of us are reaching out to help, sort of self-help books and trying to manage what is, a terribly complex situation. And I think what I really like about this book is that, there are negative things in our lives and we have to deal with them. Yeah. We don't always have to deal with each one of them, and that we need to, some things we can let roll off of us. We can deal, there's a lovely thing at the end on the back which says something about follow the pain, which essentially is just, saying we don't need to push everything away. And I think for me this was a great book to help me think through what do I need to care about, and what are some of the things that I could maybe care a little bit less about.
I've not read that one, so I'm going to do that. Last question. What are you looking forward to this year?
Being outside, people, nature. Hugs, yeah. Not these, screens, but a real person on the other side. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to that. As great as this has been, actually, to help us connect with people that we might not have been connected with in a long time. I've actually reconnected with a lot of people and have made a lot of kind of reconnections, and that's been beautiful. But at the same time, I'm ready for a new normal, which is a little bit more normal. Yeah, no, me too. But it's coming, and that's like you said, like the vaccines was the biggest surprise. I read like the 1918 flu book, and I was like, that was terrible. There's no like end of the tunnel there, and like we came so quickly, and that's a miracle of science, right? And collaboration. So to that, Justine, thank you so much. That was so fun, and I love your book recommendation. And I think thank you for outlining like the key areas of work. I think we can do this. If we can create a vaccine in a year, we can do this. We just need to really think about this.